Thanks, Debbie. Suna, yeah, thank you very much. I loved your book. I was interested by the title, Promptism, and it's fascinating read. I've been looking through it after Steve's announcement yesterday. I got the article or the email to say that it's been announced, and really nice. I think you've done some great work. I think it's very helpful. And I've got to admit that there are times where I have to look at something and the AI output is so fluent and so powerful that I'm really encouraged to believe it without checking. And I have to keep on resisting that urge to say, this looks great, I'll just take it. So over to you. So thank you very much for what you've done.
Thank you. And I will just do this and like this. Let me know when you can see the screen.
Can see it.
Super. Thank you. So, well, before we begin, I will just give a bit of context of who I am. I'm Sune Selsbæk-Reitz. I work as a data and AI strategist at Demant. So you can say that I spent most of my time actually with this system and how they are being perceived. But that is only part of it. Before all of this, before I did any of this, you can see two small books here on the screen. I used to write poems, short stories. I even published a couple of poem collections. Unfortunately, for most of you, it was in Danish. And I think that is still a part of how I think about technology, because I've always been interested in language, in meaning, and in how we make sense of things. So my background is history and philosophy from university. So I tend to look at these systems, not in terms of what we can do, but what they do to us, how they shape how we think, how we decide, and what we start to take for granted. And outside of that, I'm a father of two. I'm a husband, and I spend a fair amount of time reading and probably too much time thinking about baking bread and drinking coffee. And alongside my work, I write a lot, mostly in public through my LinkedIn newsletter and my Substack called Footnotes and Friction. I'm trying to think through some of these questions through my newsletters while they're still unfolding, you can say. And that's really where this book started. And it started from a very small moment, you can say. I was searching for something, nothing complicated at all. It was one of those things where you think, I could probably figure this out myself. But instead of Googling, I asked a chatbot, and it gave me an answer almost instantly. It was clear, structured, convincing, and in some way I just nodded along. I didn't check it. I didn't open another tab. I didn't compare it to anything. I just worked from it. And later that day, in a conversation with my wife, I found out that I was actually wrong about the information I got. And that struck me in a way I haven't seen before, because it was not that it was wrong in the first place. It was that it happened, and it happens all the time. And it was how easily I actually accepted the output. There was no hesitation, no doubt, and no pause. It just felt right. And that was enough, you can say. So I started thinking about that moment because it didn't feel like a mistake. It felt, you can say, familiar. I have a feeling it's familiar to more than just me. It feels like a habit. And I think that what we are starting to see is not an isolated moment, but a pattern. And I've been calling this pattern promptism. To me, this is not a technical term. It's not something formal, but simply a way of describing something we keep doing. It's the habit of treating machine-generated responses as truth without examining them. And that important thing here is that these systems, it's not about they are wrong. It happens all the time. The problem here is that it doesn't need to be right to be convincing in the first place. Because when something sounds right, we tend to stop there. We are not looking a second time. We are not making any comparison, and there is no real effort to questioning it. And that's the part that interests me the most. It's not the answer itself, but what happens after we receive the answer. And that's why it works so well on us. And the reason why it's, yeah, Howard?
Sorry, always a question for me is I think that we also suffer from this when people talk to us that we respect. When there's like a professor in the room, when they tell us that, then we'll believe them as well.
A con man. Exactly.
Yes.
It happened to us all the time. But the thing is, when we are talking to a faceless machine, there is authority. You cannot question it really.
Right.
You cannot take it to court. So you can also say this is happening at scale to everyone. It's not just one person standing on a bucket and scream out. It's happening everywhere all at once.
Right.
And you can say the reason why it works on us is actually not new. As you said, this is something. It isn't something AI invented. It's something we already know from psychology. Back in the 70s, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky described this, and they called it processing fluency. And it's a very simple idea. Then something is easy to understand, we tend to believe it more. Not because it's more accurate, not because it sounds more sourced, but because it feels right. And that feeling is really, really powerful because it's invisible. It's between the lines. You don't notice it happening. And these systems, these AI systems, are built for that. They remove the friction. They give us something that reads smoothly, sound confident, and feels complete. And when all of this are in place, verification becomes optional. And you don't feel the need to check because it's already feel like it had been checked. And that is actually the shift I noticed. We moved from asking, is this true, to something more simpler, does this sound right? And if the answer is yes, we just move on. And this is actually where the next layer begins. So when things start to shift, it's because something feels right. We tend to treat it as it is right. And that's where the problem really begins, because fluency is not the same as truth. It's not evidence. It's not grounding. It is not verification. It is performance. And that is, and it's very good at that. It's very good at performance because it looks like knowledge. It sounds like knowledge, but it doesn't necessarily come from knowledge. And that distinction is very easy to miss, especially when everything is, well-formed, well-structured, and delivered without hesitations. So what we start doing is confusing well-formed language with well-grounded knowledge. And once that confusion sets in, we don't just risk being wrong. We are really risking building on top of something that only sounded solid. And that's a very different kind of risk. Because if that's the case, when the real question becomes, where did the foundation actually go? As I said, I used to study history and philosophy at university. So if fluency is performance, when the next natural question becomes, where does it come from? Because traditionally, knowledge had a structure behind it. You could trace it. And the guy I put on here, the book here, Carlo Ginzburg, described historical knowledge as something built on clues, small fragments, a document, a detail, contradiction, something you can actually look at. And more importantly, things you could question. But with these systems, that layer disappears. You get the answer, but you don't get the path behind it. I know, of course, you can ask for it, but as you also said, Howard, it can just make it up. So there is actually no traceability, no way to cross-examine it, and nowhere to ask where did this actually come from. And what you are left with is something that look complete, but has no visible foundation. It's a narrative without clues, and that changes something quite fundamentally, because when the trail behind it disappears, the responsibility to follow it disappear with it. And instead, I believe we fall back to something much more simple. We are asking, does it sound right? And if it does, we just move on. And in itself, this is where truth start to shift. And when that layer disappears, something deeper starts to change. Not that we don't know how to evaluate answers anymore, but that we even mean by truth. Because traditionally, truth was something you could trace. You could go back, you could check the sources, challenge the argument. But when the past is no longer visible, we don't really do that anymore. Instead, we fall back on something more simple. Again, we ask if it sounds right, and if it does, well, that is enough. And that is the subtle shift I wrote about in the book, because we are no longer asking, is it true? Only, is it plausible? And that these two things are not the same. Plausibility can feel like truth, but it doesn't carry the same weight. It doesn't have to be grounded. It doesn't have to be stable at all. It doesn't have to actually hang together, just enough that we can examine it just a little bit. And once that becomes the standard, knowledge becomes something else, because it becomes something that can appear, persuade, and then disappear again. And we just move on. I can hear that there's a lot of typing in the chat, but if there's any question underneath, you can just raise your hand and ask during this session. Otherwise, I will keep going.
Soon I'll just monitor the chat, and if there is a question,
Super. Thank you.
I'll stop if no one raises their hand.
Thank you, Howard. So, and this is where I think gets more interesting in my perspective, because these systems doesn't just give us answers; they give us something more than that. They give us stories, and that matters because we are wired in our brains for stories. Jerome Bruner described narratives as one of the fundamental ways of how we are thinking, not just something we enjoy, but something we use to make sense of the world. And when we get an answer from a system like this, it rarely comes as a fragment. It comes as a structure with a beginning, a middle, and an ending. And that structure feels like understanding, but it isn't necessarily understanding. Frank Kermode wrote about how we impose endings on things to make them feel more meaningful. We want resolution as humans. We want things to make sense. And these systems are incredibly good at give us exactly that. Even when the subject itself doesn't really have a clear ending. So what we're getting is not just an answer, but it's a resolved version of something that may or may not actually be resolved in the first part. And that is where plausibility becomes very powerful, because once it has a beginning, a middle, and an ending, it begins to feel more true. And this is where the tension really starts to show, because once something is structured like a story, we tend to trust it, even when we shouldn't. There's a concept for this. Nassim Taleb calls this the narrative fallacy. The idea that we create simple, clear explanation for things that are actually messy and complex. We do it not because it's more accurate, but because it feels satisfying. And we see this everywhere. We see it in markets, in politics, in everyday decisions. We prefer the explanation that hang together over the one that feels and reflect reality. And large language models are extremely good at producing exactly that kind of explanation. They don't just give us information, they give us something that feels complete, something that doesn't have loose ends, but reality, as all of us knows, almost always has loose ends. So what we start doing is preferring clean version over true ones. And once that happens, truth doesn't disappear, but it gets replaced by something that feels much better, something that makes more sense, and that has consequences. And this is where we start to go a bit deeper, because it's one thing to prefer a good story, but it's something else entirely when the story explains everything. There is no loose ends, no contradiction, no uncertainty. And that kind of story is very powerful. This woman, Hannah Arendt, wrote about this in the context of totalitarian system. And her point wasn't that people chose to believe stories because they were true, but because they were complete. They explained everything. And when something explains everything, there is no reason to actually questioning it. Doubt disappears, and when doubt disappears, thinking starts to disappear with it. Now, I'm not saying that AI systems are totalitarian, but the structure behind it is similar. You get an answer that feels complete, that leaves no open questions, and that arrives without hesitation. And in that moment, there's a little space left for you. So there's actually no space for question, no space for doubt, and no space to actually think. And that's where this becomes more than just a technical issue, in my perspective. It becomes something about how we relate to knowledge itself. So, yeah. And then there is something else, something more subtle, more hidden. This system tends to agree with you. That's the other thing. And they do that quite a lot. At first, that feels great. You know, a big thumbs up on anything you are actually doing. They validate what you are saying. They soften your idea. They help you move forward. But if you stay with it a bit longer, you start to notice something. And that thing is that they are rarely pushing back. They rarely challenge you. They rarely say, this might be not right. And that matters more than it seems, because thinking doesn't just happen in agreement. It happens in resistance. When something pushes back, when something doesn't quite fit into the system, and when you have to adjust, that is where thinking actually happens. But if everything just interacts with you in a constant alignment with you, you don't get that moment. You just keep going. And over time, this starts to shape your expectation, you can say, not just to the system, but to everything else. You start to accept agreement, you start to expecting agreement. And that's where something more important begins to shift. Because a system that's always agreeing with you doesn't just support your thinking, it starts to replace your thinking.
Can I
Esty?
make a comment almost on this? Like, I think it's
please.
such a way with that in I say companies where everybody just agrees with the boss because he is the boss. And I mean that's not great. That's bad. You want somebody that will disagree with you, not just surrounded by yes men that tell you you're just doing everything right, because that's just not possible, right? There's so
Yeah,
many
exactly.
different ways to do things.
Exactly. It's the same way. But if you only had friends that was agreeing with you, were they really your friends?
Exactly, right?
Yeah.
Exactly that.
Yeah.
Because I don't think that's possible. Like if you have a deep relationship with your friends, it's almost
No,
impossible
exactly.
for you to agree on absolutely every topic. It's
Yeah,
very
but
unlikely.
no doubt about it. You should be in a disagreement all the time, and that's actually how we are growing as humans, and challenge our own brain cells to actually keep them active. So if we put those two things together, the answer that feels right and the system that tend to agree with us, something starts to disappear. That is friction. And friction is usually something we try to remove. And you can see it in technology, in processes, and in everyday life. We optimize for speed, for smoothness, and for ease. But when it comes to thinking, friction is not the problem. It's actually the mechanism, as we just talked about. Friction is what you make you pause, what makes you hesitate, and what makes you reconsider. And it's the moment where something doesn't just fit in, and you have to adjust your own thinking. And without that, I believe that thinking will become something else. If it will becomes a continuation, you just keep going with whatever direction the answer gave you in the first place. And that is exactly what these systems are optimized for. They want to keep you moving, to remove the pause, to smooth the process. But in doing that, they also remove that moment where thinking actually happens. So maybe the problem here isn't that the systems are too good, but it's that they are too smooth doing it. And that raises a different question. So what would it look like to put friction back in the first place? What would it look like to do that in practice? Because this isn't something abstract in my mind. It shows up in very small, everyday moments. So let's think about something simple as navigation. You are sitting in your car, you're driving somewhere you already know. I do that all the time where I'm driving from home to my sister's place. It's 20 minutes away, but I still put on Google Maps just because it's easier for my brain not to think about where I'm going. We have all been there, but you're still turning on the navigation and you follow it. Left, right, straight forward. And at some point, you're no longer thinking about the route yourself. You're just following. And that is useful. I know that. It removes the effort. It makes things easier here and now, but something else happening at the same time. You are giving up the decision. You are giving up the moment where you could think, where you normally could think, should I go left or right here? And that is exactly the dynamic we are starting to see when we are using the large language models. If you don't have the first thought yourself, you start relying on these systems to have it for you. And that is where the lines, you can say, start to blur between assistance and dependence. Because assistance supports your thinking and dependence replaces it. And that is actually the tricky part, is that it doesn't feel like a dependence. It feels like efficiency. And that is why it's so easily for us humans to miss it. And once that happens, it doesn't just change how we act, but it's changing how we are actually thinking. And I need to have a sip of my almost cold cup.
Maybe I could ask you a question then.
Yeah. Cool.
So what you're saying here is that almost we all strive for efficiency, and the critical thinking is going to challenge that efficiency. I'm sure you've been in meetings where we argue about everything. So we go from agreeing with everything to arguing about everything, and we need that balance. and
Yeah, of course.
that becomes hard. So we start asking all sorts of questions, and then we don't make any progress.
Yeah, you can say that. The thing is also, we shouldn't just reject all of these systems just because they are
Sure,
there
sure,
and
sure.
they are doing something, but we should be conscious on how we are actually using them. I saw just a
Right.
comment in the chat section that we can use navigation for actually seeing if there are traffic jams and stuff like that, and that is useful. When I'm going home right after this, from my workplace to home, I will rather get home as fast as possible to get to my kids and not sitting in a traffic jam. Of course, that is useful, but I shouldn't just rely on the chatbot or the machine itself all the freaking time. You should start to think for yourself. And there's a comment from Sarah.
A question from Sarah.
Yeah. Yes. Hi. Thanks for this really interesting presentation. I just what I'm wondering is so agree with everything you just said, and I wholeheartedly agree. And where I get a bit stuck right now is in the workplace. I feel like AI is almost becoming a religion. Like you have to prove to everybody that you're good at AI. And then if you, it seems like everybody carries some sort of knowledge that like, oops, we might be giving away our agency to the AI. But then everybody also seems to feel like, but not me, not me. I would never do such a thing. Everyone else might do that, but I know how to prompt right. And all these examples of AI slop that we're all swimming in, I'm swimming in AI slop. That's all because someone didn't know how to use AI right, but I do.
Somebody else.
Do you have any opinion about how on earth we can bring people to their senses? Because I'm seriously losing my mind. I'm in an AI existential crisis. Thank you.
Oh, that is a big question. Come on. For Wednesday afternoon.
Sorry.
No, there is no real and easy task for this. My book also go into something where I'm striving for a new literacy, because we have all been tossed into this world where we are just using AIs, but we are not actually learned how to use them. We have learned how to use ChatGPT, Gemini as a tool, but not as a thinking partner. We are just relying on them all the freaking time. Sorry for my French, but the thing is that we are also in a workplace environment forced to be faster and faster and faster. I had hoped for, when we are having all these efficiencies, that we could go down to a 4-week work week, or a 4-day work week instead of 5 days. But it doesn't seem like it. It seems like every organization around the globe have agreed that if we can be more efficient, we can just deliver more. And is that actually what we want as a species anymore? Or do we want to have more time to ourselves and think more critically? Maybe you, Henry, have a question also?
Maybe a comment from my side, Sune.
Yeah, of course.
It's something that I think I discussed with Howard and them about 3 years ago when I was in Norway, as well, when ChatGPT just sort of started out and stuff. It's critically about understanding what is the knowledge that something needs to provide to you. So I come from an engineering background, and I learned the philosophical part after I did my undergrad and stuff like that. So bit of the opposite of you. And now the work that I do is heavily dependent on Microsoft and Copilot and things like that. And I think fundamentally from my side, each of the tools, each of the LLMs available has a unique place and a unique purpose, but not one of them can do all tasks in all cases. No. So I would, as an example, usually I've used Copilot for a lot of cases until they updated the model. I picked it up very quickly because it provided me with a different output from the one day to the next. And then I just switched out my entire rigging setup to actually to triangulate between the actual LLMs that you have. So not being dependent on one model or one type of model from one provider, but using the strengths of each of these models to provide something and actually critique it and think it through with, let's say, a Gemini. Yeah. And that's been incredibly helpful for me to not lose that sort of real critical sense. And I mean, I think I'm on a version 2.9.8 or something of a master prompt that I use, because it's been taking a couple of months to get to something that is repeatable and is of good quality output every single time. Every now and then the model makes a mistake, and then I need to question why. In some cases, it's because the data set that I wanted to upload or the sample set did not upload. So Claude needed to make up something, and it tried to infer what I was trying to tell it about, when in fact it was a pure case of, oh, the file never sent. So I think that's also where user sort of awareness and just sort of knowledge on how to use these tools become a critical step in your actual success and how you can use these tools.
Yeah, I mean, that is really, really insightful, Henry. It's also when you use it as an, you can say, not Microsoft Copilot, but as a Copilot in the simple term Copilot. When you are on the steering wheel and it helps you, that makes sense because you are the one taking all the decisions. It helps you to actually do what it needs to do, and you can question it all the way through. But the case is also when you're using it on subject you don't know anything about. When you are talking about, let's say, the French Revolution or anything, and it just comes with a clear and stated answer, and you don't know anything about the subject, you can be deceived by it. And that is actually pretty concerning in my book.
Sune, I know you haven't given any answers, but a lot of your book talks about deontological reasoning and design, where you putting ground rules in that it cannot give you an answer that it's not traceable back. It cannot invent things. So isn't that part of a culture that you're talking about that will deal with a lot of these ways in which we're just accepting everything? Is that, I mean, I thought that was a good approach. It's a
yeah, I mean, it is a part of it, but you can say it's also up to the individual and the organization out there to actually implement it. And I'm not telling them what is a good virtue or a good ethics. That should be up to the, you can say, not the single person, but up to the organization. What are they actually optimizing for? And they should also be transparent about that. Is it solely for money? That is actually pretty fine in my book, to be money driven and efficiently driven, but you should be transparent about it.
Yeah.
So okay. I will just see if I can rewind, moving in. Okay. When we are seeing these answers arriving, it does that before the thought is fully formed. And that changes something quite fundamentally inside of our brains. Because normally when we are asking a question, there is a moment before the answer, a moment where you can hesitate, that is not entirely sure of what you actually meant, and you are still thinking. But here, when we are using these large language models, the moment almost disappear. You type something and instantly you get a fluent, fully formed answer back, and the answer starts shaping the questions you are actually asked for. It nudges you in a direction. It frames the problem. It suggests what is the most important and what doesn't matter. And because it happens so quickly, you really don't notice it. You just go with it. And you move from one answer to the next and to the next, and without ever really stopping to think the thought through for yourself. And that is a shift, not because in what we are knowing, but in how we are thinking. And once that starts to happen, we're no longer just using the systems. The system is starting to shape how we think. And that raises a different kind of question, because what does that actually do to knowledge itself? So, yeah, William, you are welcome to jump in.
You know, it just reminds me of how careful people had to be in the very old days when they had telegraph systems. And the cost of sending just a few letters was so high that people spent ages formulating their statement that they were going to send. And I think that's part of the problem, is that the cost of having to sit down and really think through what you're after, there is no cost.
No, exactly.
And therefore there's no yes.
Yeah, I mean, you are completely
Yeah.
right. So you could say, if all of this is true, if the answer arrives instantly, and if they feel right, if they shape how we think, then something else will follow. Knowledge become more important. And that is a bit counterintuitive, I know that, because the common assumption is the opposite. That you have, when you have a system like this, you don't need to know as much. But I think it's the other way around, because without knowledge, you have nothing to compare the answers to. You see the structure, you hear the confidence, but you can't really judge it. You recognize the fluency, but not the accuracy. And that is a very important difference to notice. Because if you can't just judge the answer, you are not really using the system. You are relying on the system. And that changes the role completely. So instead of knowledge becoming less relevant, it becomes the thing that allowed you to stay in control. And without it, you are left with something that feels right, but that you can't really stand behind. And that leads to a different kind of skill. Because traditionally, in most of our work, the focus have been on producing answers. You know, can you solve this problem? Can you write this report? Can you give the right response? But when the system do that for you, that's no longer the main challenge. The challenge shift from answering to judging. You can look at an answer, but can you really evaluate it anymore? Can you tell what is missing, what is assumed, and what might be wrong? And that is actually a very different skill set to acquire, because it requires that you don't just accept the output, that you stay involved with the output, that you question it, challenge it, and sometimes even resist that fluency. And that's not something the system can do for you, no matter how good it gets. In my perspective, that is how it built, because the system can generate answers, but it cannot take responsibility for the answers. And that's where the shift really is. Not that we can produce anything, but that we are willing to stand behind the words it's producing for us. And that brings us to something slightly more uncomfortable. Once these systems becomes part of how we think, how we make decisions, the question of responsibility will change. In simpler cases, it's quite clear. If a student using an AI to write an essay for some assignment, the student is responsible for the output. Of course, they will be graded. But as soon as we move beyond that into organizations, into decision-making, into systems that influence outcome, it becomes much harder to answer the question of who is actually responsible. Because now there are many layers involved. There is developers, there is training data, product teams, organizations, users, in fact. And when something goes wrong, where does the responsibility actually land? Because when everyone is involved, it starts to feel that like no one really is. And that creates some sort of a gap. I would like to call this the responsibility gap. Not because no one should be responsible, but because it becomes difficult to point to someone who clearly is the responsible one. And that is a practical problem in most organizations. But it is also a deeper one, because if responsibility becomes unclear, then trust becomes unclear as well. And that raises a very simple question in my mind. Who actually stands behind the answer? The uncomfortable answer is no one, or at least no one in the way we used to think about it. Because when we read something traditionally, we know there's an author, someone who had made a choice, someone who had taken a position, someone we could agree with or disagree with. But here we get something else. We get a statement without a clear author, without intention in the way we normally understand it. And without someone we can actually question. And that changes the relationship completely. Hannah Arendt, as I talked about before, once described something she calls rule by nobody. It's a situation where decisions are made, but no one can be clearly held accountable for them. And this starts to feel a little bit similar to that, because it's not that the system is in charge, but because responsibility is no longer clearly attached to an output. And when that happens, we are left in a strange position as the users. We are receiving something that looks like an answer, but we don't know who stands behind it or what actually stands behind it. And that means that we can relate it in a usual way. We can't question it in the same way we could question a person. And this shifts something quite fundamentally, because knowledge has always been something we could challenge. But here the challenge becomes harder to place, and that's where the responsibility quietly moves back to us as the users. So if no one stands behind the answers, then responsibility doesn't disappear, it moves, and it moves back to us as users, because in the end, we are still the readers. We are the ones seeing the answers, we are the ones interpret the answer, and we are the one deciding whether it's something we can trust or something we should question. And that hasn't changed at all. But no matter how fluent the system becomes, no matter how convincing the answer can feel, that responsibility is still ours. And that might not be what we expected, because these systems feel like they are taking something away from us. But in a sense, they are giving something back. We need to stay involved. We need to question. We need to verify. We need not just to accept the answer of what sounds right. And that is not a technical requirement. It's a human one. It's on every one of us. And if that is the case, when the question becomes, what kind of interaction do we actually need from these machines? Right now, that interaction is very smooth, very efficient, very easy. But as we saw earlier on, that smoothness comes with a cost. It removes friction. And maybe that is exactly what we need to bring back. Not everywhere, but in the right places. Moment where we need to pause, moment where we need to doubt a little bit more, moments where something needs to push back, because those moments are not failure of the systems. They are signs that thinking is still happening. And that changes how we think about design as well. Maybe a good system isn't one that just gives you an answer, but one that can help you question it. One that can show uncertainty instead of hiding it. One that can create small frictions for you to stay involved. Because in the end, that's how we keep our thinking alive. And without that, we are left with something that sounds right, but doesn't really belong to us. So if I have one thing I want to leave you with this today, it would be this: an answer is not an insight, because an answer can arrive instantly. It can be fluent. It can be convincing, but an insight, on the other hand, takes time. It requires effort. It requires you. And that's really the distinction this book I wrote is trying to make. Not because right or wrong, but between what sounds right and what you are actually have actually thought through. And maybe in a world where answers are becoming easier, the real task is to stay with the question just a little bit longer. Thank you. And of course, here I have a little QR code if you want to buy the book.
Yes, it's fantastic. But what we'll do is we'll have that award now, and just to see who gets the book for free and who will need to buy the book. So,
of course.
And then we'll go on to some questions. I'm sure there's lots of different questions. So let's, Debbie, I don't know if you're around. Would you mind just bring the award, the prize?
Sure. So if you'd like a chance to win a free soft copy of this book, please raise your hand. I'll have it open
in Teams,
in Teams.
Raise your Teams and don't put it down. Don't put it down, otherwise the numbers get lost.
Yeah, once Sune has said the number, please keep your hand raised just so we can make sure that the correct person gets the prize. So now if you want to raise your hand and drop your hand, I'll close it in 30 seconds. So I see we have lots of people who want to win this prize.
Want to buy free stuff. Come on, all of us want to win something. Feel important.
Exactly. So I'm waiting on Christy, Daniel, Daneo, Rita.
Christy had a hand up, I thought.
It's not letting me raise my hand. I don't know why.
Oh, no.
There we go. Your hand is up. Oh, no, then it's down again.
Is it up now?
Yes, it's up.
Okay.
All right. So we have 20, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Number 25. Between 1 and 25. Sune, if you can pick a number randomly.
I have, all of us have a lucky number, and my lucky number is a little bit weird. It's number 13. Always 13. So let's take that one.
Rian, congratulations, Rian Lawrence. Well done for your prize. I'll contact you if you don't mind dropping your email in the chat, or I'll drop my email in the chat and we'll organize that you get that copy of that book. So congratulations. Thank you everyone for taking part. Better luck next time, I hope, for everyone else. I'm sure we can open the Q&A now. Thank you.
I actually have a small story of why number 13 is my lucky number.
Yes.
The first football soccer shirt I ever got was from the local team in Copenhagen called FC Copenhagen. And the player I really looked up to was the later manager for the team, Ståle Solbakken. And Ståle Solbakken had number 13 on his back, and he was only in the club for 3 months until he got a heart attack on the training field. So I ran around a whole year in my teenage years with a shirt with a guy that was no longer in football. Yay! Yeah.
Fantastic.
Sune, this has been fascinating and really just speaks so much to one of the things that I've been working on, which is, you cannot lose your intuition. You've got to listen to your gut instinct when you're doing something. You can't switch that off.
Completely agree.
But I think the problem is that, and we're actually seeing that was one of our challenges, is that building the intuition takes time. And especially with the people coming out of university, they actually need several years of experience. And again, this AI will cut that intuition out when it relates to work. Of course, there's other intuition.
It's so true, Howard.
If I could just ask you a quick question, Suna. A lot of your approach to resolving the problem. So your book is really great. It deals with these issues, and I think you've done a great job challenging us. But you also give us some ideas on how to deal with it. And you refer to that as the deontological design. Maybe if you could just summarize that very quickly, because I'd hate to think people are like, oh, well, that means we must resist all the time.
I mentioned it in one chapter of the book. You can say it's a philosophical design framework I'm working on, and I'm constantly developing. But it consists of 5 pillars. So you need something that is trustworthy, explainable, equitable. It also needs to be somewhere we have a human in the loop. Intervention, not just from time to time, but in the right places all the time, and something I call moral continuity, because we cannot just set us values at the product launch. It should be something we are evaluating over time, because shifts, minds change over time. What wasn't appropriate to say today was appropriate saying, 20 years ago. So our biases, our hidden biases, is evolving over time. So we should constantly evaluate what we are doing with our system. This isn't just for, you can say, AI systems, but in all design systems. But it's also a framework where I try to give the different people in the different, you can say, stages of development some prompting questions to actually go in with, and they can question how we should build a given system. So it's not giving answers, it's giving questions they can use.
Right. And I suppose also the problem with humans in the loop, and we spoke a little bit about it, was that sometimes they are then asked to make a judgment call. And they are also pushed to be efficient and get the job done as quickly as possible. And so sometimes they would just agree or whatever it is, because disagreeing needs that they need to go and check it up. And this, if you're using statistical modeling or outlier detection, some of the answers are so complicated in terms of how you got there that can we really argue with the statistician that built this thing? So there's quite a few challenges that people feel inferior to be able to challenge that thought process or that way of calculating it. Fantastic. So, anybody else? Are there any questions that we have before we close? I know it's past the hour, but Suna, do you have some time to answer some questions?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, fantastic. Henry, yes.
This has actually reminded me so much of conversations we've had in the past, Howard.
Yeah.
And I've recently actually completed quite a lot of Microsoft courses on building agents and everything.
Right.
And the insights I can share on a live session is basically it's got a lot to do with the knowledge grounding that you use with your agent. So there is a lot of effort. It is not just a tool that you just throw something out and it can do a lot of things. Yes, that's great. It can do that, but it is a lot. It's got a lot to do with how do I use this? What do I tell it should be its frame of reference? Basically the same thing that I needed to do with my students when I was in academics is what are your references? What are your sources that you are allowed to use? You're not allowed to use the web. You're not allowed to use Wikipedia as a reference. You're only allowed to use these grounded sources and then bring me something. And then I can have a look and see, yes, I agree with this or not. And what I'll do a lot of times is I'm prepping training materials for a client or something that is based on Microsoft information. I will use these LLMs and I'll use the different ones and have them critique each other on the different model settings that you can get. And that actually helps with the thinking process to make it more interactive than to just sit and produce content that is already available.
the interesting part about these LLM is also there is some hidden worldviews built into them or anything. It was just shifted a little bit in the favor of presenting Benjamin Netanyahu as a greater guy than Wikipedia did. So it's also something that can shape how we are actually thinking about things. So if you're not knowing what ChatGPT OpenAI is standing behind or what their training material and the guardrails are built on, can we really fully trust it? Really fully. But,
yeah. Mubin? Thanks, Henry. Mubin?
Hi, everyone. Hi, Howard.
Hi, Mubin. Salam.
Hi.
Alaikum salam. Yeah, it was a very meaningful session. Thank you so much. I did not bother Sune because I was really, it captured my, cognitive assistance. I didn't bother him asking questions. I thought, okay, let me wait later on. Yes, rightfully said. The only challenge that we are seeing as practitioners is the lack of domain knowledge, whatever LLM you use. And I see it in practice when I use one LLM with specific domain knowledge that I have, and then I use the same prompt into different LLM, probably that is more mature than the first LLM, and I see a different output altogether. Right?
Yeah.
Then it's for me to discern as a practitioner what to take as a takeaway and what to model it on. It really is quite difficult. And people learning prompt engineering without understanding the bedrock importance of domain knowledge, really things fall in place. They get lost. I'm a prompt engineer. I know how to write a prompt, but without the core fundamental domain knowledge expertise, it does not seem to work.
No, exactly. You're completely right. It's also, as you said during the presentation, Howard, what about all these junior either developers or lawyers coming into the field straight from university? How will they actually get the domain knowledge? How will they actually become seniors? And I'm really fearful for all of this AI automation. There is, of course, a lot of dull tasks that can be automated or given to AI, but is that actually beneficial because we are removing a lot of, you can say, know-how building in many of these minds. So is that actually beneficial 10 years from now? I certainly don't know.
Yeah, it's challenging. Henry?
Maybe a question from my side to the seniors in the room is it not part of your responsibility to build up these foundational knowledge sources based on the open source knowledge that these LLMs are based on, to create curated, essentially reference manuals that can be provided to a junior to state, you need to do something. Yes, it's based on open source knowledge, let's say Microsoft Learn, but I'm going to give you an even further curated list on what I feel for this domain is applicable. And then limit the ability for AI agents or something to be able to reference something that is completely incorrect, but not give them all the answers essentially in the process.
Yeah, I will imagine that is a way to go. But I don't think we have found the formula yet. That could, of course, be one way to go. But this has happened so fast over the past 3 years or so. So I'm not sure that we are in a place where we can actually see what will work and what will not work. So I'm curious on how organizations are actually doing this.
I mean, one thing in response, Henry, I still remember the first 4 years, set of years that I developed, and it was, I was so fortunate that I had a senior who had been there for many, many years. And if I summarize what he taught me over those years, it was how to think. I mean, this guy could read mainframe dumps. You know, when the mainframe crashes, they'll give you these dumps out. He could read them like English. And he taught us how to think. He questioned everything that we asked. And he said, why do you think that? What's the reason? And it wasn't about giving you the information. It was about giving you the way to think and how to question, how to go about the learning. And I found that amazing in that situation. But you are right. There's also ground truth that's appropriate to be established within your domain. That's very helpful. William.
Just a question. Does the LLM get grown to believe, or not to believe, does it get grown and the emphasis adjusted based on the fact that an answer is given multiple times and not resisted? Does it then say, well, this is actually must be true because I'm not getting resisted on it? Does that happen?
Now we're going into some LLM architecture, but in my mind, the thing that is happening is this reinforcement learning process where people have given thumbs up, thumbs down. And people tend to like a pleasing answer over a difficult one. So people have tended to actually like and preferred answers that is just smoothly delivered. So I will imagine that is part of how we are building these systems that we need somehow to challenge. But on the other hand, it's also difficult because who wants to be the first major manufacturer of LLM to actually make a more, you can see, sassy LLM that actually talks back to you, and in that regards maybe gets fewer subscriptions. That is a difficult challenge.
It always comes back to money.
Yeah, it does.
Exactly right.
William, it's interesting because what the LLMs are saying, it's over this question of politeness versus transparency. Okay, so the LLMs, the interface, the way it works, favors politeness so that it preserves dignity. Now, I think Sune had a great thing of, well, that politeness is great, but it's not transparent, so it's not really my friend. It's not helping me learn in that situation. Now, one of the things that I found to be very helpful for my learning is when I asked the questions, I basically said, please position yourself as a professor of this domain and ask me questions if my understanding is correct, and then be critical about my response. And it was amazing. I was using it on DMAC, and it to say, please explain this thing to me, and I'd give an answer, and he said, but that's very weak. You haven't really addressed the real answer. It was amazing how that stance changed when I put it into the role of the expert within a domain. So you can put yourself into that situation. But
that's really helpful, Howard. That is so helpful. Give it context to give you, so that you can actually have an opponent. I mean, if you're playing chess and you've no idea what the story is there in terms of the opponent, you're definitely not going to get it. Yeah, brilliant. Yeah. Thank you.
Johan.
Yes, can you guys hear me? Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. We can. So.
Sorry, because I wasn't myself. Because I was late. Just something quick, and you actually did address that, Sune, but this is this thing of this fluidity, where actually the AI can give you an answer very, very quickly. And in the real world, people are so, I find that actually people trust people who can shoot from the hip, which I call them, the cowboys. They trust them, but then eventually they get proven wrong. Okay, and then it's a big palaver. Now, when it comes to the AI, now actually everybody's got their own little bot, and they get the answers, and now suddenly they start, when you start actually pushing back. But they say, no, but we all know this is the right answer. So then you've got this actually majority which says, we heard or we found out this is the answer from AI, but from your, because you, the subject matter, or you've got, the right actually curated sources. You know what the right answer is, and your answer is correct from the right source. So actually, how do you deal with that? I mean, it's a little bit long-winded, but I find it, actually, how can you deal with that from a human point of view?
But it is difficult because these large language models are like the know-it-all uncle at the dinner party. You know, the one that knows everything about Premier League football and French philosophers and all the sports cars ever made. So it's actually pretty difficult if you don't have the domain knowledge to actually challenge it. It is really, really, really hard. So I will never use an LLM to actually tell me everything it knows on a subject, but I need it to, you can say, educate me. I can use it for that, where it actually can make me some questions, and I can slowly but steadily learn. There is more and more LLMs that actually have this study function that is okay. I've tried a few, but I will never use it for something I don't know anything about. Then I'm a very, let's see, old man in a younger man's body. I'm not that young, come on. But I will always tend to read something that is produced in a book or a human at least before going to an LLM to learn anything. Or I will do, as you did, Howard, use something like the Notebook LM. Where you can actually reference certain types of informations into it, and it can give you something. Notebook LM are excellent at making podcasts, small questionnaires on a subject where you know the sources. But if you don't know anything from the subject, I wouldn't use it.
Yeah. Okay, yes, no, look, and you're completely correct, and that's the way to go, you know, to use trusted sources. But the problem is, not a lot of people know that they should really concentrate on to get the trusted source. They will believe anything.
Of course. So this is also coming down to all the educators around the globe that need somehow to have a new tool to educate about to all the youngsters around the world. I know when I was in high school and ChatGPT have been there, I will have used it and I will have cheated my way through high school because it was easy. I would have done that. And I don't blame any youngsters these times around to actually use ChatGPT. It makes sense to do it because they can do things faster. But we need somehow to also make it a literacy for teachers around the globe to actually teach this to the young folks.
Okay, thank you.
So you're raising something really important, right? And I can see this coming. I think we can all see it coming. And that is that we are going to have information tagged as to whether or not it came off a human being or whether it came off some bot or whatever the case is. And that's going to require what they've already implemented. I don't know if you've noticed that LinkedIn and Facebook and all the rest of it, they're requiring biometric sign-in now because they need to know that you are in fact a human. And I think this is one of the reasons why we would support it, is to say we need to know whether or not this information came from somebody. You know, was it real or not? Not that all human beings get stuff real, but you know, we need to know in the internet what is the provenance of this thing really.
Yeah, it's provenance and lineage. Yeah.
And the thing is also, I have nothing against LLM produced outputs. When you're using it, let's say that you are not that fluent in writing skills, and you use LLMs to actually write posts on LinkedIn. It's fine by me as long as you are the author for the words you're sending out. It's fine to have a tool. You can also say that spell checking in Word is also AI. It's just a dumber AI, but so it will just advance over time. So as long as you can stand behind the words you are sending out into the world, well, by all means, more the merrier. They can go into the conversation.
Accountability, right?
Accountability.
Sune, a question. Maybe I interpreted your message a little bit wrong, but you were quite critical about fluency, and I've seen so many people now suggesting that AI literacy is not the right thing; it's AI fluency, and it seems like maybe that's not the right term either.
No, I don't think so. But it's also, as I said before, it's happening so fast at the moment. We are in a groundbreaking scenario at the moment where everything shifts. Everyone feels behind because we are not having 24 hours a day to actually learn about all these tools. I also feel behind from time to time when I talk to some of the young student assistants here at my work, where they can just do stuff with AI I have never thought of. But the thing is that we shouldn't feel behind. We should just go on and trust our own gut feeling. Of course, base it on data, but data is also biased. It's small stories that is also being interpreted by how we are seeing the world. And something that could be true today can be wrong tomorrow. So it's also about this thing where we can tagging truth. It's also a little bit difficult because what is truth really?
Correct.
Everything is subjective.
How AI fluency is a bit ambiguous because it is the AI being fluent, or is it our fluency in being able to use and prompt the AI?
It's like AI literacy. It's first of all understanding of the ABCs of AI, and then it's fluency in terms of being able to communicate and
maneuver
use. And then
100%.
it goes on to acumen in terms of, how do we get AI to do the work that we need it to do and to manage it appropriately and to drive the right outcomes from a business point of view. So it's a continuum that they build on.
100%. But that's
Mobeen?
on the action side, right?
Yeah.
was talking about fluency being
but it's
a different aspect.
But sometimes it's a false sense of understanding. That's what I'm concerned about.
Yes.
Mobeen? Last question, and then.
Okay. Listening to you, Howard, you said it's a progressive elaboration. We have been spending a lot, our thoughts, our work, and our diligence around prompt engineering, where we understand how do we instruct AI, and then the top layer comes is the context engineering. How do we give AI the right information? And now we have gone past both prompt engineering and context engineering. Now we are talking about harness engineering. That is how we build the system around AI so it can work reliably. You get prompts from LLMs. You can just write a sentence, ask the LLM to create a prompt, and then use the same prompt in different LLMs, and the context. That is where your domain knowledge experience comes. But what is important? Do you know how to harness this context and the prompt that you have to get the meaningful outcome so that your work is more reliable and more credible?
And Mobeen, this is exactly what I believe Suna is doing with that deontological design. He's forcing you to put the guardrails in your prompt to ensure that you don't get rubbish back. I think that's the key. Fantastic, guys. Thank you so much, Suna. Thank you. It was fantastic. I loved the engagement. It was very nice. And hopefully you do so well in your book. It's been fantastic. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
And Howard, before we leave, just a suggestion. The book is fantastic, and Sune, I really like the engagement. I would advise we should have 3 draws, not 1, for the free copy of the
book. Of course.
It's always good when you deal with the people in the Gulf. They never. You got to be able to get to the right level of agreement.
Absolutely. Okay. Thank you so much,
Thank
Howard.
you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Cheers, everybody.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Everyone.
Thanks, Sinan.
Thanks. Bye.
It was wonderful. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Okay.
I'm a little bit tired now. Oh, it's fine.
Too much thinking.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
I need to go home and play some mindless games, I think.
Thank you very much. Okay.
But thank you,
bye.
Howard, and bye.
Bye.